Hey, Melanie.
Greetings.
Good to see you again.
Ollie.
In thinking about today's episode and today's guest in particular, um, particularly when we had the preliminary conversation with her, I was having this internal dialogue around issues I've had in the past, particularly with Black folks, mostly from New York, some from LA, some from Texas, where whenever I would meet them, particularly if I was outside of Boston, they would say, "Wait, there's Black people in Boston?" And I'm like, yes, because I was born and raised in Boston. So I'm like, yeah, there's a bunch of us. There's quite a few of us who were born and raised there. And they're like, really? And then as I got older and started meeting folks like you who are transplants to Boston, and then was still going outside of the Boston area, meeting these folks who were like, there's Black people in Boston. And I'm like, yes. And people actually choose to move there and stay there. And, they look at me like incredulous, like their jaws are dropping. And I'm like, I don't know why this is such a hard thing to imagine. And I think a lot of people are just thinking about the lack of support that they suspect. Well, let me actually rewind. I think they're thinking about the racism from the 70s, that particular form of racism due to busing and due to some of the other factors that put Boston on the national stage. But then they're also just thinking about
which weren't unique to Boston. They weren't unique to Boston, but they reported nationally for sure. Yeah.
Exactly. But I think they're also thinking about just the ways in which the support for Black folks and for the Black community may or may not have changed over the decades in Boston and other places. So when you think about successful Black communities, you think about Atlanta, you think about DC, maybe Houston, I'm not really sure. Maybe some Chicago, I don't really know where the successful Black people are. Maryland, well, that's DC. And so I guess they're thinking, well, does Boston have that? And if so, what form does it take? So, just that was part of the internal dialogue I was having when thinking about our conversation with today's guest.
Yes. Who herself is a transplant, I believe. So I'd be curious to hear what she has to say about this personally as well. Well, we're excited to talk about these and other matters with Courtney Brunson today because she has a big, important job, which is thinking about housing access for Black people around the state. There's so much to say about it. We'll see where we dive in. But let me just start with background on Courtney. She's economic and racial justice advocate who has built a robust professional background in policy development, civic engagement, and legal advocacy. She currently works as the director of Greater Boston Partnership to close the racial wealth gap at the Boston Foundation, whose purpose is to increase wealth for people of color in Greater Boston through home ownership. Yay. Courtney's legal work has covered topics like fair housing, labor and employment, and campaign finance and ethics law. Her policy acumen has developed from her time in nonprofit and government policy roles, like as the policy advisor at the Black Economic Council of Massachusetts, and as legislative correspondent on Senator Elizabeth Warren's economic policy team. Delighted to invite Courtney on.
Really glad to be here. Thank you very much.
Thanks for joining us. Good to see you.
One thing I have to say off the top that I think speaks to this conversation is there are so many words in terms of my titles and the work that's to be done. On one hand, I think it should speak to our succinctness in talking about the issues. But on the other hand, sometimes you really do need to take the time to lay out. There are multiple levels to this. There are multitudes, there are complexities. And just, one thing I really like about your show is you don't just think about it in a one-dimensional way. So I'm hoping to build that conversation in some way of maybe just apologizing about how long my current title is and all of the other titles in the past.
It's all good. It's all good. We'll take all those titles and more.
Yeah. Good.
So let me ask this. Maybe this is like a crazy question, but do we just have Stockholm Syndrome? So like I said, I'm from Boston. You two moved to Boston and you chose to stay and root yourselves. And yet, Black folks from outside of the Boston area would be like, why are you there? So do we all have Stockholm Syndrome? Like, what's going on?
Okay, so it's funny that you're asking now. When I look outside and see how utterly cold it is, I would tell you, yeah, there's something wrong with me that I chose to live this life. But when I think about how the weather is incredibly nice for the rest of the year, then I think that people really just, we were just referencing this, don't understand A, how we can live in a city that has a legacy of racism, but also have a city that has a richness of a Black culture and success. And at least for me, something you just mentioned in your introduction is where I grew up was South Florida, that has a robust community of Black and brown folks in particular. But when you ask about whether or not that opportunity translates to wealth, to in the form of real estate ownership, in the form of financial literacy, that's where the conversation really comes silent. I'm thinking about my family, my grandparents, the cities like Opelika and Liberty cities that were the projects. I went back there for my wedding a few weeks ago, and I'm like, why are there high rises that are triple the cost of, homes or apartments that weren't there even 5 to 10 years ago? So I think there are conversations that are worth having to say there is a difference between a critical mass of populations and making sure that those populations have access to the knowledge and resources and the power that they need in order to translate that into wealth and wellness. And I think that's particularly something that Boston and the greater Boston area does well. We can stand to do better. And I know we'll have that conversation as well. But I think that's what really drives me here, to see who we have at all levels of government that are really representing our interests, but also understand that there are still multiplicities there in where we've gone and yet where we need to be.
Yes.
Okay, so I feel like we just had a sermon right there.
Understood.
Courtney.
Let's break it down a little bit. Let's break it down a lot. Let's break it down. So you came from South Florida. You're now in Boston. You see all the different layers and levers of policy and government. You see the way in which Black communities in Boston can build wealth that you didn't necessarily see in South Florida.
No.
So what was your path? Like Melony read your, so what was your path that sort of like led you to these discoveries and brought you to Boston?
Yeah, that's a really great question. Well, the path, and sometimes it's part of what I think is really good about this story, but also really speaks to the things we need to improve upon. Because in my way, it was kind of a series of happy accidents. So it started as me really wanting to just explore the world beyond what South Florida could provide me. I was one of 6 siblings, and my dad made a deal with every single one of us where he said, you all can go anywhere you want as long as you get a full ride. And we're like, oh, okay, yeah, that's relatively easy. Long story short, I was 5th out of the 6 siblings, and I was the only one that left school, because you think that, my dad had a successful accounting business. My mother was the first Black woman to be in the Miami Police Department. So there were so many barriers that they overcame, and that I was a direct beneficiary of that. But even still, because of a lack of knowledge about what options were available to us for higher education, and frankly, a lack of resources to really think about what options were available to us versus actually available to us, I was just resigned to, staying in the state. That just so happened I was able to, because of someone I used to dance with, have the opportunity to get a full ride through a scholarship foundation called the Posse Foundation that gave me a full academic scholarship to Western Massachusetts at Mount Holyoke. And that was probably a good first instance of someone who's not from Massachusetts being highly skeptical. So this is where I give credence to the argument, because they wanted to pitch me. At first, they're like, yeah, it's like right outside of Boston. I'm like, you know what? Let me do some Googling. Let me check. And then I'm like, what is a place called South Hadley? What does it mean to live in a mountain valley? Like, I kept asking questions. And the more I knew, the more I was just like, well, this kind of feels like in the middle of nowhere. And I really don't know what it means to live outside of a city. And once I actually got there, it was really my opportunity to just figure out what it looked like to be in a different context, a different physical space, but still find community that was similar for me. And that came into place, frankly, by trying to find good food. So I was up there, I was missing some like black beans and rice that I could have from any local Cuban places. I was looking for some plantains that were made in the right way, and we can have arguments about what we think the right way is, but I'll pass that for now. And that was where I was finding large Puerto Rican communities in Holyoke, large Black communities in Springfield. So my search to find meaning in just like faces that looked familiar, food that tasted good, thousands of miles away from my home is what led me to communities that look just like mine. And I'm like, really? In the middle of a state that's really far away from what I consider a big city? Really? In a place that maybe they grew up a little bit differently, but we had so many things that we had in common. That was really what led me to say, okay, maybe there are some similarities here. Maybe there are some opportunities here that I wouldn't have even known existed, if I had not, gone to school. And even having the opportunity with Elizabeth Warren was a similar story where I, like my friends, wanted to go somewhere for a semester or junior year, like many people did. I wanted to go to Georgetown. I wanted to intern at the White House, and I had the opportunity to do both. And then it all fell apart because I couldn't afford to go. And I was devastated because it kept being that barrier that I was just talking about, where I did what I needed to do. I got the grades I needed to get. And even still, it was inaccessible for me. So for me, I came downtrodden back to Western Massachusetts. And someone basically told me, they're like, look, it's not the White House, but there was just this senator that was a professor from Cambridge that just got elected. And, my first reaction is, all right, here we go. Another academic who pretends that they know about the lived experiences and the issues that we need to find. You know what? A job is a job is a job. I'll get some money on the side. I'll have the opportunity to, just create some policy chops and just familiarity with the area. And that was how I ended up joining Elizabeth Warren's team as an intern. And that, again, was a happy accident. But being able to learn the type of policy priorities that she had, help with the constituent management work, I think that's something that every single person, especially when they're having conversations about, well, how difficult can it be to buy a house? All you have to do is fill out an application. We need someone to either be on a call center. We need someone to be like a waitress. We just need every single person who asks that question to have face-to-face conversations with people and just understand the complexities that come with doing seemingly easy things. And that was my way of understanding there are a lot more barriers to people just fighting to have the same opportunities, not just, frankly, of white households and communities, but just well-versed communities, either because of the income that they had, the backgrounds that they came from. And that was something that really just got me passionate about this work. You fast forward many years later, it was me just trying to find different ways to do it. I went to law school so I could have the legal vernacular for understanding these issues. I went to Capitol Hill to understand how federally it might differ from what we talk about in the state. I had my opportunity with state organizations that helped understand, okay, maybe the conversation's different at the state house than it is just in front of your mayor in a local city and town. And my professional vocation is using all of the resources we can to advance racial and economic justice by constantly understanding, hey, there are some really good things that the state of Massachusetts and our cities and towns do, even in areas of homeownership, which I'm happy to talk about. But there are also a lot of different ways throughout the nation that we can do better that, if only we had, either people really knowing about what opportunities were in front of them, but also holding the very same folks that I'm really excited to have and power to say, hey, these are things that we need to have conversations about. And I'm thankful that we're, already having those conversations right now.
Yay.
Yeah. Good news.
I love your story. I love your story because you mentioned access or lack of access, depending upon who the subject is. And you describe, I think you under describe your story because you say it's a bunch of happy accidents. And maybe for you it was, but just hearing about how you went to a certain school and you had this certain opportunity and then you met this person and then you had this internship and then you went to law school. I mean, that's more than happy accidents. I mean, there was definitely a trajectory that propelled you forward to doing this work and to having the passion that you have for this work. So, I think it's more than more than a series of happy accidents. I mean, happy for you to describe it that way, but I think it's more than that. And, it's interesting I'll be interested to hear how you would describe how you take the access that you have achieved
Mm.
and translate that into providing means of access for other people, whether it's in Boston or in greater Boston through your job, through other things. Like, how do you see that sort of happening?
Yeah, that is frankly front and center in a lot of what I do. And I think the reason why, especially in light of all of the conversations we had in 2020, we're like, it's really important for us to think about equity. But when I just like really break it down, when I feel like people say words like equity, I feel like sometimes we're talking about different things. So
Mhm.
for me, what's front and center in order for us to have equity, it's not just to have everyone in the room. It has to mean that everyone in the room is at the same level of understanding, has the same level of opportunity to contribute, and has the same ability for their contributions to be valued. Access, I think, is front and center to that. So, a practical example, and this is what makes me really excited about working at an organization like the Boston Foundation. I know we've always either or we have all played roles in either being at an event, being on a panel at an event, or even hosting one. And something that was made clear to me in the very beginning was saying, okay, if we're going to have an event, what are we going to invest in making sure that it's accessible? Practical things, making sure it's hybrid. So allowing people to come in person if they want to, but also making sure that it can be virtually available now and after the fact. For me, that was something that I wanted to talk about with our funds that we have at the Boston Foundation to make sure that we had language accessibility. So, a practical thing that we did that I can do because I'm at an organization like the Boston Foundation is making sure that we have active translations in Spanish and Cantonese and Haitian Creole because we are talking about serving Black and Brown communities. If we're talking about the issues of Black and Brown communities, we have to make sure that it is articulated in the languages that a lot of these communities speak. But it's also thinking about really knowing where your deficits are. So the first event that we had in our Minding the Gap event was really talking about land wealth. So we were talking about, Boston's legacy with redlining, but even before that, the role that like slavery and Reconstruction played, because we were ready to have the conversations about how that played out in the South, but not ready to have those conversations about how it played out in the Northeast, even thinking about the 20th century and really how areas like downtown Crossing used to be predominantly Black or South Boston used to be predominantly Black. So having those conversations, and I remember having multiple comments, and this was maybe a week after Thanksgiving, and they're like, you're surely not going to have this conversation without talking about our Native communities, right? And that was for me something that was like, wow, it isn't just for us to think about, hey, I was thinking about these ways that we are expanding access to the event and making sure that we talk about these issues in a robust way. It's constantly thinking about, but who else isn't at the table? Who else are we not thinking about? But then there are other ways that it's really just expanding access of information. So something that's really exciting about my role at the partnership is the Boston Foundation recognized that there was a lot of great work that was happening in the housing and the home ownership space. But we and anyone in our partnership or outside of it will mention that we still have a really significant housing crisis. And one of the ways that we saw our role as a convener to address this issue is by bringing everyone in the room and saying, okay, you're doing this, you're doing that. Where are the deficits? Where are some areas that people don't think that we are doing as much work that we need to do more work on? A perfect example of that is COVID meant that we had a lot of federal funding come into our state that could really be leveraged in communities to help people keep afloat on their rent, make sure they could pay their mortgages. But there are also incredibly inventive programs like the Dreams program, which is basically a program that provided people thousands of dollars in down payment assistance. And I know some of my colleagues will be able to say, we were out and about. We were in churches, we were in supermarkets, we were in farmers markets, we were everywhere telling people about this money. But you ask another community, they're saying, well, we didn't know about it, or we knew about it too late. And maybe we knew about that program, but we didn't know that we could pair it with this other program and make sure that we can use both to get ourselves into a home. So that's a long way of saying that it's access in having people's, understanding of what's happening in conversations, making sure their issues are front and center. Even when you think you're doing a good job, we can always do a better job of putting those issues front and center, but also making sure that communities can have access to information, not too late, not when the money's already near, you almost run out, but as these programs are getting launched, that's a third way of making sure that things can be accessible to make them effective and impactful.
Mm-hmm.
Melanie, you have a question in your mind. I can see it form.
It's funny, letting it land because I don't actually have the vantage point of thinking about statewide programs.
Mm.
So maybe there was a question that you saw for me, Derek. And I don't even know if it's a question yet for this point in the conversation. But, I also know that those programs don't have the same currency inside Boston as they will somewhere else.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
The economics in Boston are just different. Even less housing availability. It's more expensive and it's supremely more competitive because there's so much cash concentrated here that your government program and your this incentive and that really does not stand up to the cash that you need to compete with from other people who can just buy a thing without giving it much thought. So,
and maybe even if they do have the cash, it's a more difficult sale, right? They're like, okay, well, if I'm doing this and that,
why does the seller have to bother with that? Yeah. So I think, I don't know that I have a question yet. I think I'm just settling in to say, okay, do these programs have impact around the state that I don't know that they're going to necessarily have impact on in the city? And maybe there are ways to have impact in the city that I haven't imagined yet or haven't witnessed. So I think I'm considering.
Well, can I ask you all a question actually? Because what that makes me think about is if I know I have my elevator pitch. If someone's like, I want to live in Boston or the greater Boston area, what's your pitch for why this would be a good idea? Given you all in your positions, if someone came up to you and said, hey, you know what? I have some savings in the bank. I'm thinking about buying a home for me and my family. Do you think that's a good idea? Do you think that's a good investment? And if so, what advice would you have for me in navigating this process? Because I think for me, by virtue of my job, I have a lot more of an opportunistic, hey, this is all of the things that you could take advantage of. But from your perspectives, I can imagine you saying, you know what? It's a really great idea for you to think about land in central Massachusetts right now. Or maybe you live in Rhode Island and you commute in. Do you feel like you have advice for them and, genuine feedback for them about how they can crack these very issues that you just mentioned?
Yeah. Okay. I guess we're going to that. The question isn't, sometimes people come with this question of, is this a good time to buy? And I think in some ways that question is so irrelevant. The question is, can you consider buying? Can you afford to consider buying? Because it is so important to own property, especially in a place like very dense, low housing availability metropolitan area like Boston, but that applies to lots of metropolitan areas and even suburban areas around the US right now. For much of the US, it's a post-pandemic phenomenon, but for Boston, this has been true for well over a decade. So we have a serious housing crunch, and absolutely you should own property if you can own property. There is not even a question about it whatsoever. And so I'm always guiding people to buy the best thing they can afford to buy, not just what they have up front, but with what they can manage over time. And that gives them or allows them flexibility and mobility if their priorities change. Can this evolve with you? Can you evolve out of it if you need to? Those are critical questions, but we can honestly only have that conversation about Boston if you have enough money. So really, to your question, I'm asking you,
you reverse. Yeah.
how much money do you have? It is really, truly simple. We can have this conversation so efficiently because this is true supply demand situation. And so what I'm trying to contemplate is there a way that government interventions can interrupt that or create a wedge in that? Or and it's, do you say that there's certain territories of the city or certain properties that have been owned by the city that get freed up that can only be used in certain ways? Maybe. I'm just trying to think about all of that. But in just the sort of general conventional market environment, it's not about what you want or what you think is a good idea. It's about what can you even afford to pursue. Okay. And so, yes, if someone says to me, but I just want to own property. Oh yeah. Okay. Then we can broaden the scope. We can broaden the map. We can think about central Massachusetts. We could think about the north going up towards New Hampshire and Maine. We could think of certainly the south, going towards Rhode Island and in Rhode Island. At this point, what we're seeing is the suburbs of Boston is really Rhode Island and parts of New Hampshire. That is the suburb.
Oh, do you think people in Rhode Island and New Hampshire would be okay with you categorizing them as such?
They've known this for a long time. They've known this for a long time.
You're like, this is common knowledge.
I mean, New Hampshire became a suburban Boston like 20, 30 years ago. I mean, people fought there a long time ago. Rhode Island is the newer factor in this. It's still somehow retains this feeling of like a separate metropolitan area because of Providence being
brown.
Yeah, but I mean, no. It's part of I won't say all of the state because it's still a state.
Yeah, you'll leave some behind.
Yeah, but I mean, like northern Rhode Island, like Providence, and the northern, like Pawtucket, and like those places to the north, right on the border. Absolutely, they're part of metropolitan Boston. But I want to take your question, Courtney. I want to take a stab at answering it because I like where Melony went with her answer, but I want to kind of go back to like a little piece of it that I think Melony didn't quite address because you asked.
Well, I wasn't even finished.
Okay, I can put you back. We can put you back. Go ahead.
Let me add one tail to it because there's part of it is if your goal is to own something, yes, let's figure out the best possible thing for you to invest your money in and see how it will perform for you. Mm-hmm. If your priority is, I need to live close to whether it's close to work, close to relatives I need to care for, whatever, and that is inside the metropolitan area, then you have some harder decisions to make. You may not be able to own unless you have significant cash, or you can buy in a location where it's questionable what that is. You. And so these are the things that you really have to be honest with yourself about. What are the resources you have and how can you leverage them? And it might mean in some cases renting here and buying elsewhere, to be frank. But I think for a lot of people, there are economic pulls that are really hard. And I just want to say, we are really at the point where I just had an intro conversation with a couple this weekend who they have savings. Each of them has a retirement account that they can draw from. In addition to that, they have investments they can draw from to put 20% down on a certain price range. Let's say 600, 700,000. You could buy something with that. You could buy a small single family in a lot of areas around Metro Boston, small single family. You can buy certainly a comfortable condo right in the city. Okay. But their monthly payment has a cap on it. And these are people who are professionals. Okay.
I like the way you pronounce that. Professionals. Got it.
University professionals. Okay. Like, and if they were to pay what it costs, even with their 20% down payment, what it would cost with what interest rates are, their monthly payment would be more than 50% of their income. Now, I'm just going to be frank with you. These are white folks with professional jobs in academia. Okay. So you're talking about folks who don't even have that kind of savings being like, how can I buy and afford the monthly payment? And so we really then have to start sorting your priorities
and ranking.
Important than affordability. And so, yeah.
All right. Well, now I need your take as well, Derek. Like, I want to hear what you have to say about this.
So, first, I agree with Melony. So, if someone said, because your question was, if we had an elevator pitch for why someone should move to Boston, I would start asking a couple of questions. But my first question would be, how much money do you have? Or even if you don't want to tell me, bring at least 20% more. Just bring more money. Just of every. because you're going to need more money. Because whatever amount you have, I mean, unless you're coming from San Francisco or New York and maybe DC, I don't know.
Can confirm. Yep.
Yeah. So maybe if you're coming from certain cities where it's about as expensive, if not more so than Boston, bring more money, bring whatever you got, and then bring more because you're going to need
money. You bring family money.
Right.
Your parent. That's what people are doing. That is how people are doing. And so
Right.
it's like, who has family money and who doesn't?
Right. But the question was about, or the question I think was about, how do you thrive? Because it was about, if I'm bringing a family with children and blah, 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 like, what's your elevator pitch for Boston? And so beyond just bringing more money, one is, if you can afford to buy in Boston, it's a great opportunity. It's a great short-term or long-term opportunity because your property will appreciate very quickly. So if you're just coming in as an investor or just someone who's living short-term and wants to buy and then sell very quickly, and Melony, you can speak more to this than I can. I mean, your property is going to appreciate, and so you're going to make a return. So just on the economic side of it, you're going to make a return.
I'm more temperate than that. I would say it's very likely to hold value no matter what.
I see that asterisk. Yeah. Okay.
I've seen dramatic appreciation over the last decade. Cannot say that will continue at the same rate, but it will certainly very likely hold value in most sections of Boston, even if we have a major economic crisis. And that's a lot.
Yeah.
But beyond that, just thinking about thriving in Boston, it's a good place to live. It's a good quality of life overall. Like, we don't have some of the factors that you find in other places. I think politically and socially, it's fairly open. As the only person on this call who grew up there as a child, like, you can have a very good childhood there. I don't feel like I have Stockholm Syndrome, and that's why I can talk about Boston in a positive manner. It actually was a very good childhood. And when I went to other parts of the country and I was like, ooh, what happened? They were like, this is just what it's like. And so, there was a little bit of a sense of isolation living in Boston, because there were times when I was a kid where I would very rarely see the American flag flown anywhere. You would see maybe state flag flown everywhere. And then when I would go to DC or go to New York in particular, I would see the American flag everywhere. And I felt like I was going to the United States, even though I knew I was in the US. It was just a very weird, New England is a very different place. Some ways very, very good. In other ways, it's just different. I mean, there's not a lot of bad things I can think about when I think about New England and think about Boston, other than the weather and sometimes about the parochial nature of things. But that's changed. That has changed since I was a child. And so I find that people are a little bit more open-minded. They're a little bit more willing to discuss and willing to share ideas. And even when people don't agree, for the most part, I have one or two conservative friends who are, they're not ultra conservative, but they're conservative. Mm-hmm. But even when we disagree, it's not to the point of sort of like, okay, it's the Hatfields or the McCoys. Like, we're not going to go at it. We have a discussion. We disagree. We're like, okay, we're done. And we just keep it moving.
Well, they probably can relate. I think what's changing is the parochial nature, even what I've experienced in the last 20 years in Boston, is people have more of a sense of what's happening in the neighborhood next door to them.
Yes.
Or they have a vested interest enough to know what matters around them, even if they don't agree. And that, I think, is different just in the time that I've been here.
And what I like too is just the lack of complacency. And this is where, I take shots at other people. So if we have people complaining to you all directly, I apologize in advance. But I'm thinking about, if you ask a New Yorker, what is one thing that you can change about New York City? They say, nothing. I love my city the way it is. If you ask someone from Philly, what can you change about the city? Nothing. I like the city the way it is. By and large, and maybe it's just folks that I'm talking to in Boston, really no one that I'm encountering is saying, nope, it's great. Every single person that I'm encountering is like, I like this, but our night scene can be a little bit better. Like, yeah, this area is really good, but I love more green space, even if there aren't these large, like, structural changes, but frankly, we still can continue to make, there isn't any type of just complacency by and large where people don't have other areas areas that they think that we can improve upon. And what's really exciting is how that translates to our government institutions and our private institutions. So Melanie, you just highlighted way back when you're saying you're trying to pitch people how much money you have, and you ask quite pointedly, what role can our government institutions play? What role can our private institutions play? I'm saying a large role. And I think people in our institutions would agree with that. I think a lot of places, will say live free or die. I have everything that I need to live my quality life. There's no role for either any other stakeholder. That's what I think Massachusetts does differently and Boston does differently, where they can identify, hey, the government has to play a huge role in putting money in your pockets. Even recently, and criminal justice related matters, the city of Boston can say we have a role in apologizing for harm that has been committed to individual citizens. But what really excites me, especially as the director of the partnership, and something that definitely increased over 2020, is the role of private institutions. Banking and financial institutions, by and large, especially related at all to racial issues, they're like, look, we solve it to the extent to which it helps our bottom line. Yeah. And I'm not, naive enough to say that that's, completely gone away with, but I work with private institutions every day that say that this is not only something that's front and center because this is something that's affecting our world, but it's also affecting the people who work at our organization. This is also affecting our consumer base. This is also affecting our profits. And by this, I mean racial injustice, economic injustice, the lack of equities that we have. So what's really exciting about, living here, and a part of my pitch is you're never going to be in a circumstance where you look around and have people say that there's nothing that needs to be improved, that there is not a single stakeholder, if it's a local market executive or local city councilor, that won't be able to tell you we all have a role to play in addressing some of these larger fundamental issues.
I'm glad you're hearing that. I'm glad you're hearing that and you're having those conversations, because that's not always been my experience. And I think
that's good to know. Yeah.
I think it depends on the sector. So in higher ed and finance and banking, yes, places where there's a lot of money and therefore a lot of critique and investigation, sure. On the cultural side of things, I would question that seriously, because cultural institutions, but even small organizations say we are the culture. We bring and therefore the culture is us, and we should all. And I'm like, no. These times we change, and so like I'm glad to see that you're hearing voices advocating for change, or at least open to critique in the cities you're working with. But I think it's not everywhere, not yet.
Yeah. And that's a part of the equity conversation too, because just like I was talking about earlier in our conversation, that means that I need to think about how that role, because at least for me, we're thinking about, narrowing a racial wealth gap. And our first, foray into this is homeownership. But if I'm thinking exclusively and just one-dimensionally towards someone's ability to live long-term in a community, and I can't think about how they're able to create, celebrate, and thrive in their culture because of deficits in our cultural institutions. And that's a part of the conversation too. That's something that I and other people need to think about more. But I'd like to know where you think those deficits come from, because at least for me, I'm immediately thinking about a lack of investment. I am a proud Somerville resident. And one of the things that I think we do really well, most better than a lot of cities and towns in this country, is investing in artists. So I'm curious about, what are the ways? Is it giving more resources? Is it uplifting people from a variety of cultural contexts to be able to say it's not just one, it's all? What do you think, what role can we play in just unearthing some of that and connecting it, to the conversations we're having about our economies or our political systems, and saying, hey, our cultural institutions, how we live and how we talk about how we live in the day-to-day and celebrate ourselves, is as much a part of the conversation as some of these other issues that are top of mind.
Man, that's a big question. Can I take a run, Derek? Because I know you have plenty to say, but I want to tie what you just said, Courtney, to what we were just talking about, because I'm realizing I didn't even actually hear the question that you two were speaking to. I didn't hear the question of pitch, right? I can easily pitch all day and do, especially the greater Boston area, but Massachusetts as a whole, for lots and lots and lots and lots of reasons. Quality of life being a nice overlay to talk about all of it. Really hot. But I think where I'm hearing, and that's why I've stayed, right? It's a progressive place. It's a place that where people are invested and will argue and debate all the ways that you described. And so, Courtney, what you were saying about like people in government care, people in the business community care, you really can take housing as a rod right down the center of it. And I can say this because I have clients who work at all levels of government and in corporate environments. And I'm going to tell you, because Boston, and as Derek had said to me years ago, Melanie, Boston is a small town. And I more all the time. We are a big city in a very small footprint. We're a metropolitan area that has this kind of impact and power in biomedical and in universities, right, and academic, like all, but it's a small place. So that impact can be felt in all the ways. And so what's good about that in some ways is that I would say in a lot of ways have representative government because the people are actually elected. First of all, even before you get to government, people are very, very educated, like proportionately or disproportionately educated and overeducated in these communities, right? Whether they're born here or not, really highly educated population and population that debates, right? Love about it. And then that's reflected in who ends up in office. And thankfully, to a larger and larger extent, who ends up in office is a reflection of who's in these neighborhoods. If you run housing through that, I'm going to tell you right now, people who have gainful employment, important leadership positions are challenged by the very same housing affordability questions for real. Yeah. For real. So you're talking about, it's not about absolutely you should own something here if you can, for all the reasons we just described. And that's why there's such a premium on it. And so who gets access to it? So if you're talking about, you just asked the question, Courtney, if you can remind me, you were asking about like, how do you make a difference, let's say in the arts? Oh my God. If you think about a neighborhood like Jamaica Plain, that's where the immigrants, the queers, and the artists went. Okay. And that's still represented, right? That's still represented. We're like the baby sibling of Somerville. I have a son. Right. Or this little neighborhood in Boston that's, has some of those same characteristics. But artists can't just live and thrive here like they used to. Have a loss of this and that. You just can't. How do you make it so artists can actually live and have enough money to not only make their art, but to like eat in the city? How do you make it so that artists can afford to congregate around each other? Like we can have ecosystems of artists around each other to play off each other, whether it's about performing arts or craft. Like that's the stuff that makes communities thrive and makes them attractive. It's the artists who are often the ones who take activism to the streets. They're the ones who are actually making the political concerns visible to all of us through performance, right? Through organizing. That stuff's so important. You think about the people who stopped Route 95 from running through a whole bunch of city. That's artists, activists, immigrant people. That's the stuff that makes things culturally relevant and exciting and frankly desirable to people with money. So you get to a point where those folks who created the character can't afford to stay, or new generations of them can't afford to come and play.
Or they create and then they beautify a neighborhood and then they get pushed out.
Yeah, you have, I've heard somebody joking on a local public radio station recently, but it's not that far off, where you have young professionals talking about people who are earning $100,000+ a year, housing in apartments with like 7 people to an apartment in Boston. So you want to talk about culture. Culture doesn't have the same economic cachet, even though it has the economic impact, right? We don't empower it or imbue it with the same cachet. And so how do you make it so that those folks who quote unquote create or nurture culture can actually afford to stay and keep making their mark and keep things interesting and complicated? That's tough, man.
Yeah, I'm gonna give it to you to tackle now that we really fleshed it out. How are you gonna answer that question, Derek?
Oh man. Okay. First, let me start off with an anecdote. So when I first moved back to Boston in 2003, shortly after that, I was working some job and a coworker was like, "Hey, I'm going to this party downtown. Do you want to come?" And I'm like, "Yeah, sure, I'll go." So we went to this party. We got the subway. It was dark. It was probably winter-ish. We go through this doorway unmarked. We go up a couple of flights of stairs, narrow stairs. I mean, this is like something out of a movie.
I was just about to say, this is the type of movie where the Black people die first, Derek. I hope you survive this story. Go on.
Well, I am here. I'm not like Tupac's. I'm not like Tupac's all the day. Yes, here. And my friend was ahead of me. So, we're going a couple of flights of stairs, and we go through this door. And when my eyes adjusted to the light, I saw these gigantic, they look like disco balls, but they were gigantic. They were probably about, I don't know, 2 meters, so 6 feet in diameter, hanging from the ceiling. And there were a couple of them because it was this loft space. And people were sort of just like mingling and drinking. There were like candles and low lights. And then some people were like swinging on them. And it was like some artist who lived there who had just created this. And so it was like this like interactive installation. That was the only time I've ever seen anything like that. It was in I think it was a residential building.
And you sure you weren't in New York? I was about to say that sounds way cooler than anything in Boston.
Yes, you were 100% right. I was not in New York though. I was in Chinatown. So, I was in downtown Boston, but I was like, wow, like this was amazing. I had never seen anything like that since. And so I think when it comes to the culture in Boston, when it comes to creating culture or supporting culture in the arts in Boston, one is that we just have to be less afraid of the weird, less afraid of experimentation. We have to provide the spaces. So even before people own their homes or whatever, we have to have the spaces for it. And like so much artist space is being converted into residential. It's being converted into retail. It's being converted into other things. Like artists don't even have the space to be creative.
And art organizations are running out of money since the pandemic. So like whole artist organizations that are collectives of artists supporting artists and supporting that infrastructure, they are buckling.
And they don't have the resources for the creativity.
And they don't own the spaces they have, or if they own the spaces they have, they can't afford to keep maintaining them because they're not getting enough revenue. So there's a whole cycle here that's very complicated.
But let me also address the institutions in the room. So the institutions, I think the parallel here is, I don't know how well you remember this, but there was a generation or a period of time when there was all this conversation around redefining or expanding what the standard of beauty is in the fashion and other industries, from being, thin and white and blonde to being much more representative of the diversity of the human body. And I don't think we do that well, if at all, in Boston, particularly on the institutional level. It happens a little bit more on the smaller organizations in the neighborhoods. It doesn't happen on a neighborhood by neighborhood basis. So Melony, you and I often have these conversations around JP versus Roxbury, and like where culture is, you often say it's JP, I often say it's Roxbury. It's both. But when it comes to how people view it, they say, oh, JP, because it can be consumed and purchased here. Whereas Roxbury, it can be enjoyed and participated in here. So I think it's different. Like,
never said the culture is in JP, but not Roxbury.
No, it's officially on the record.
True. You're right. But I think this whole idea around the standard of the way we talked about the standard of beauty and how we expanded that on a broader scale. How do we talk about the standard of culture? Because culture doesn't really have a standard. But when we're talking about like what does it mean to have culture? What does it mean to exhibit or create or participate?
Like what are the codes? Yes.
Right. I don't think we do that well. And post-pandemic, when there was all this thrust around supporting the museum, supporting the thing, it was kind of like, well, why? What have they done? And why do we reporting? And so, I was thinking that it kind of needs to be expanded upon. Courtney, do you need to go?
We switch. See, that's the beauty. Listen, if we're going to talk about different spaces and our ability to transform them, that includes my office being turned into the kitchen and being able to do that. But I think it's really helpful to even hear your perspectives on how these things have to be more just available and not really pit them head to head. Because some of the things that I'm thinking about, and it actually feeds into what Melanie was saying, is like the cultural cachet. Because for me, what that brings up is just thinking about things like nightlife and enjoyment. There is a prioritization of culture, but the culture is the Puritan-esque, we don't have happy hours, we close things by 2 a.m. generously. So it does actually feel like, and I feel like that's what Derek's unearthing, like there are priorities that are being established either overtly or, a lot more subversely that do have priorities. And then what I'm also thinking about is I think there's a ton of like the amount of times that I've gone to places like the MFA or the Isabella Gardner Museum, beautiful institutions that have beautiful things. But my point is there are a lot of areas around culture where we have decided to say, this is what we invest in. This is what we value. This is what we put power behind. And what I'm learning from this conversation is there is a great necessity in really separating those things to be able to say, there is a multiplicity of things that we can invest in, or at the very least, maybe it doesn't mean that we put a bunch of dollars, because I'm hearing what you're saying, Melanie, where there's a limited amount of dollars. Maybe it just means that we just acknowledge that there are certain investments being made in specific areas to be able to say, what happens if we take a step back? What happens as we give opportunities for creativity and newness and ingenuity? And this is where Mayor Wu is doing some incredibly creative things where she's saying, hey, we have government monies that we're just going to give people to have programming in the summer to do what they want to do, or having a lot of like Newberry Street, different streets throughout Boston being closed on the weekends so people can create programming around that. So I think that's one of the areas that we come back to. And me being the institutionalist I am, there is a role that government institutions can play in this. There is a role that private institutions can play in this, because I think it'd be incredibly disingenuous if I look at the artist and say, if only you just broaden what you prioritize or what you do, that means that we're forgetting where the resources are, we're forgetting where the power is to enable that to happen.
I want to add one little piece of nuance to what you were saying around how institutions engage communities, because I think, yes, there is not even institutions, but just how some of the city works. So yes, there is a Puritanism to it, but I think there's also an element of paternalism to it. Yes, no, you can't drink and you can't do this and you can't do that because it's for your own good. Full of paternalism to it that I think we know it started in the 1800s when the Irish came. And the English were like, "Oh no, 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 no!" But then it sort of like got adapted by each new community in control, and it's just lasted. And again, when we hold up the mirror and say, "Okay, let's reevaluate this. Let's try something new," because we can do it. We have the ability. We're all adults in the room. Let's do it and do it differently. And I don't know when Boston's going to do that.
I agree.
I appreciate that. And the thing
I see the look in your face. You had something about that. Yeah.
The thing that just continues to pain me, it's like, yeah. Even if rules are loosened up and it gets cooler to like, yeah, of course, have the tea run 24 hours so that people can hang out downtown and all neighborhoods of Boston. And you can make it so that museums are open later and that's the mayor's doing now, making it so there's certain weekends where anybody can go see it for free, or at least anyone in the Boston public school system. All that is so important. And if we're, to my mind, just focusing on the cultural layer, because goodness, the fundamentals, the structural fundamentals need to change so that people can actually physically be in the city and have housing security in the city or adjacent city or like on the, so it's like, to me, I'm like, I like all that. And I'm like, that all can happen. It can flourish. It can have currency for people's lives if commuter train is affordable. They can buy a house on the commuter line. If we build light rail that's beyond what we have now, like, come on, like that's the stuff to me, like the fundamentals need to change. So that more people have access, because what is here in the city, there's such a premium on it. And I think that's the kind of stuff where, Derek, when you and I are comparing Jamaica Plain and Roxbury, I'm just saying that there's a kind of different economic base, like artists who own their space or have more of a kind of platform, can do things more, can make more money on it, can make money on it faster and longer term. Like that's a problem, that there's an inequity around that.
Yeah.
So I just, yeah, man, I can't think about this stuff without thinking about, again, power and wealth. So if the governmental institutions, you want to get together and brainstorm on it, talk about how we make it so that artists, immigrants can afford to stay in the like in the immediate vicinity, then I'm excited and interested. You know, if you're talking about all of this is about transportation. You cannot talk about art making without talking about public transportation, access, affordability, and where it reaches to. Period. Just period. That is what's influencing property values. Period.
Let's go back to political will, though, because there's a cycle here. Because if you have a place that has low property values, they have low political power, and then there's no political will to support the community to have more resources, to have more political power, to have, that's a vicious cycle. Because
it's getting better. You see that reflected in our city council. Boston is getting better at that. I think that again, our representative government is more reflective of communities that would have been sidelined for in generations. So I have a sense of
sure. Let's have some hope. However, we still need to correct the mistakes of the past.
Yeah.
Because the beauty of Jamaica Plain, which I will not deny, came with the expense of Roxbury. So think about the Orange Line. The Orange Line as it exists today, if you lived in Roxbury, Jamaica Plain in 1980, you didn't have the Orange Line the same way you have it now. The Orange Line as it exists today was built in 1987. The Orange Line as transit line was built in 1900, and it went down Washington Street the entire way to Forest Hills. And then they moved it in 87 and replaced it. They replaced an elevated rapid train line with a bus. A bus. And at the time that they had moved that train line, 1/4 of all Bostonians lived within a 10-minute walk of that train line.
Oh, that's huge, Derek.
And so it's great that Jamaica Plain has the this and the that, and it's lovely, and wonderful, and people can do this, but it came at the expense of another community that Dudley Square became, or Newbury Square became what it is now, because transit moved. And so you sucked the economic life out of it. You sucked the foot traffic out of it. You supported it with.
That's it. That's it.
And so
speaking to how interventions happen not in alignment with what communities and neighborhoods and residents are saying, but counter to it because of that paternalism, because of all of these resources and power that's being utilized in ways that don't
honestly where the loudest voices are that government will respond to.
And that's exactly what I was about to say. And Melanie, you spoke to this, where we are incredibly lucky about not just the levels of education, but awareness that so many community members have. So I actually have trust that we're all in alignment, that it's not one thing and that it's everything. And that I am confident in the communities that we have, that we can talk about culture and transportation and housing and environmental equity, especially for communities that are at risk of either losing their homes because of flooding or any other type of cultural or, climate related phenomenon. We have robust organizations and community organizers if only we give them the opportunity to show up local community meetings that aren't at 4 p.m. on a Monday when people are working or picking up their kids. Have the opportunity to speak to any state regulations that our state is having for making these types of issues in a way that's understandable for people to, take part in, or making sure that boards and commissions have representation from the people who are from these communities and understand these issues, not, just one person that has a certain resume. So at least for me, that's, to come back to where we started, a part of what makes this place so utterly great to live in is that we have people who are working on these issues. We only need, like you highlighted, the resources for them to not just exist, but to thrive, to own where, the buildings that they're in, to own the resources they need to capitalize, but also making sure that they are a part of the conversations that are being had about all of these issues. We can't just prioritize one. We can't just talk about one. It has to happen in unison with one another, but that can only happen if all folks are at the table and have the ability to be at the table.
Yes. Oof. I like how we started and ended it with this again. Full circle in so many ways.
Yeah, this is how I know I'm excited to talk about these things. And I think it's incredibly important. That's, speaking to just the importance of what you all are doing here is just these are the types of conversations that people are having. But like we've talked about, there isn't a premium. This is something that you're like, aren't we having like these conversations in, the supermarket or this, that, and the other? So what you all are doing here is so incredibly important because it means that we can have this conversation and bring other people in. We can have conversations with people who are in different spaces and, the city and the state that we love, even if people make fun of us for it, in a way that really just equalizes who knows what and what's available and who's out there and what we're doing. So that's my pitch to say thank you all for what you do here.
One more thing I'm going to leave you with. One more thing to leave you with, because you are a C person. This is for Courtney. Like, how we talk about movements and right, the sustainability and the progress of a movement is gonna be a reflection of those who have the most need, right? Getting on. So like it's like if you're at a protest, you actually want people who have mobility issues to be leading so that we move at the pace that can bring along everyone. Right. And so if we're thinking about it from that perspective, then I would say policy is kicking ass when artists can afford to live in a place that's central. They can have a congregation and an ecosystem of other artists, right? They can be around each other, creating things and modes for us to all engage in it that we call culture, and they can make money off of it. If artists can live centrally and make money doing what they do, we're
and it doesn't. And I'm thinking about how that translates to elderly communities. I'm thinking about Black churches and their inability to stay in the communities they've lived in. This city is important when disabled and elderly people can navigate our city without it being a feat and making it impossible. Our city is a type of city when an immigrant that was here 10 years ago or 10 minutes ago has their ability to connect themselves to public and private resources to thrive. So your message, Melony, like that, you could just copy and paste in so many contexts, especially for the folks that need to be at the front and lead what we're doing.
Yes.
Courtney, we're going to have you come back. We've covered, so we're the title of this episode is long-term big picture, and I think we've talked about the long term, and we are talking about a very, very big picture. And of course, we can't do both in the amount of time that we have. So if you're amenable, we'd love to have you back to continue.
Happy to be back.
Because the big picture is so big, we need to break it into smaller pieces.
Yeah, I would like to. Yeah. Well, we settled on culture for a little bit, and that was helpful.
Yeah.
There you go. I love it.
All right.
So hope you'll come back. We really appreciate you spending time with us this time.
Happy to be here.
And for those of you who are watching, if you have questions or comments, and we hope you do, because we gave you a lot with this episode, to leave questions or comments in the question or comment field of wherever you are watching or listening. And we will look forward to seeing you on the next episode of the Black Lining Forum. Take care, everyone.
Now.